that measurement doesn't work at all for connected TV, where generally speaking, you
Right.
can't click. And it doesn't work nearly as well for something where there's a heavy in-store component as well.
Right.
So you might, if you have good loyalty data, a retailer can still do some of that closed loop attribution, but it becomes, Todd, to use a dirty word, I hope you don't have to put explicit on here if I say view through, but it is going to be a
You
post view
have been listening to
exposure.
our episodes.
Yeah.
That's good. You're listening to the Middlemen Podcast with me, Tom Lemongello, and my co-host, Todd Sawicki. Our careers have put us in the middle between retail, media, and brands. But retail media is a closed loop, so we're here to open up the channel and let you listen in. Join our discussions with the people who make retail media happen. Today, we're going to be talking to Marcus Pratt, SVP at Mediasmith, somebody that, Todd, you've known for a long time, super sophisticated guy in the agency space.
Yeah, Marcus and I go back probably 15 years because he has always been very tech forward. And as an independent agency, Mediasmith is well known as an early adopter, as an aggressive user of tool. They were early on the programmatic trend. And he's been a customer of mine in the past from a platform standpoint. And if there's someone who really you want to speak to who really knows what they're talking about with regards to trends and things that are new, Marcus is a great person to get a good perspective on. And what's great is he is actively buying retail media. And so when we talk about are agencies going to show up, are they going to be behind this, I think, seismic growth in retail media? I think Marcus kind of points to, yes, they're going to be a factor. Now, is it roses today? No. There's a lot of fragmentation. It's still a challenge, but for those willing to invest, there's a lot of good and benefit, and Marcus really speaks to that. We heard from Eleanor in terms of someone who's a few weeks ago got a great handle on the practical realities of a lot of these different platforms that the retailers are using and putting in front of the buyers. And Marcus is giving a good perspective of how do agencies think about buying retail media and what's the reality of it today and what's the opportunity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people out there tangibly understand sort of Eleanor's role where she's using the self-service platforms for the on-site retail media part. What I was a little bit shocked about was hearing an agency like Mediasmith being in charge of the offsite media for retail media networks as early as the pandemic. Because for me at that point, there wasn't a lot of competition. Even Goodway Group wasn't in there yet. And so it was interesting to hear that he was that early. And because he's that early, he's got a real perspective on sort of how the capabilities have changed, even CTV and other higher funnel channels. So that part of it is, I think, is a great chapter of this episode.
What's interesting is we talked to our colleagues in the space, and they look at, and we were discussing the retail media forecast that eMarketer just produced, and they were somewhat skeptical of the growth in terms of, our agencies really going to want to work with retail media? Are they going to give up control? They like to have control over campaigns, the ability to manage and deliver them. And my point of view is I don't see any contradiction there, because as the tools evolve and as the platforms evolve, they're becoming more sophisticated and they speak. Again, we many episodes ago talked about Neon from Horizon Media. I think there are others. The DSPs are getting in the space. There are SSPs who are emerging, whether it's Kevel, who's pushing into programmatic. Cody is pushing in that regard to retail media. The future is going to be cross retail, which really, I think, speaks well to what agencies want to do in terms of buying at scale. They love the audience and the first party data. The attribution data is great for what they want to do. And you can really see how as agencies shift into buying retail media, how that's a huge win at the sale to push retail media and really see the growth that eMarketer is talking about. I think so. Marcus's perspective, I think, is really ties some strings together in terms of where retail media is and where it's going and how an agency looks at the space.
Yeah, and I think agency perspectives enable one level further in terms of where they want to see the measurement go. We talk a lot about where MMM and other types of more sophisticated tactics where they are today and where he thinks they might be going. So again, just great to talk to somebody who knows the space from the media agency perspective.
Yeah, anyone who's in retail media who is looking to drive more dollars through the system and understand how agencies think, this is absolutely a must-listen episode.
Super psyched to be joined by Marcus from Mediasmith, which is the agency. What's really interesting is Marcus and I, being in the ad tech and programmatic and media buying space for a long time, I've sold to Marcus in the past, have had a long relationship, and my perspective, Marcus, on you is you are absolutely one of the most tech-forward people in the agency space. You were early to jump on DSPs and programmatic. You've got strong opinions about the strengths, the weaknesses of all the things you have to use and leverage. And I think, and what was fascinating is we bumped into each other at the Marketecture event in March earlier this year in New York, was learning how Mediasmith and yourself are involved in the retail media space. I hadn't expected that, right? One of the things that I think is interesting is what is the role of agencies in this space? And are they buyers? Are they service providers? Where do they fit? And so welcome, and looking forward to hearing Mediasmith and your story and how you guys got into retail media.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Feel free to describe Mediasmith for the folks who aren't familiar in terms of your agency. Your founder, Dave, is a really interesting background and perspective, and you all being an independent agency in San Francisco. And I think that'll be helpful for giving context.
Yeah, absolutely. So the agency was founded in 1989. So I think that makes us the same age as Taylor Swift. I've been there a long time, thankfully not quite that long, but founded by Dave Smith and his wife, Karen, very early to digital, based in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, in the .com. Again, I didn't experience that, but, early banner ad buys and that sort of thing. I joined in, I think, 2007, right as programmatic was really about to take off, and started our practice there. And then in 2018, me and 3 other longtime employees did a management buyout and took over from Dave and Karen. So I'm now one of 4 operating partners, owners at the agency. We have always been strictly on the paid media side. We don't do creative, focused on media strategy, planning, and buying across all forms of media, but with a heavy emphasis on digital. And Todd, you know me certainly on the ad tech space and my love of the complexities of programmatic. So I think that sort of naturally took us into
Love,
retail.
by the way. Love. Yeah, we could put quotes there.
Absolutely. Love, hate, all things in the middle.
Yep.
But, if everything just worked out of the gate, it would be so boring. We did not have any plan to say, hey, we got to get into retail media and see what this is. But I think that naturally put us there as retail media is growing, right? As it takes up more and more of digital ad spend. I think us and every other agency are going to be intersecting there. And, it's something that we've kind of been tracking and seeing, I think probably 7-8 years ago now. I'm not sure, talking to Roundel, and it's like, you can do what with, target data, and to talk about how that might work for CPG clients of ours and dipping our toe in the water. We've typically been separate from like shopper marketing in the traditional sense. So when we've worked with clients that do have a retail presence, they often have a shopper marketing team. They have a separate budget. And we noticed there's a little more overlap, right? In terms of like, hey, are we both thinking about programs with Ibotta, or how can we use this data on retail purchasing? But certainly those budgets and teams and measurement were historically pretty siloed, and we sit more on the brand side of things. But we're media planners and media buyers. So as retail media grows, it's okay, how does that fit into our plans? Or even more broadly, commerce media. So, we're doing stuff with Connective, which is United's network for B2B accounts of ours, saying, hey, we want to target business travelers on their way to a conference. So I'm seeing that expand a little bit beyond retail, and it doesn't have to be strictly endemic. And in that sense, we've also used Amazon, leveraging their DSP and their proprietary data to target people who might want to change car insurance providers, as one example. So we're very much on the buy side of that. Where things have gotten a little bit interesting, and it's a fun peek behind the curtain, is a little over 4 years ago, we started working with PetSmart, and we really pitched them for their brand media business But they said, well, hey, we have this JBP program and we need to deliver media plans for our clients, which are CPG, largely pet food suppliers, some other, apparel and that sort of things. And some of these companies are the largest CPG companies in the world, and they've got healthy budgets, advanced needs, and they're looking for, okay, how can this particular retailer differentiate across everything else that we're doing with our own branded budgets, and then of course competing with Amazon, Walmart, and other specialty retailers. So we've managed for the past 4+ years all of their offsite retail media. So we put together plans. Some of them are bespoke to a particular launch that's happening there, and identifying that target, and then activating all of the first party data that PetSmart has from their very well subscribed rewards program across everything that's offsite. So their packages typically include on-site CRM, and they talk about store placement and all that, but we saw a lot of growth happening there in programmatic display, lots of social, some search and shopping activity as well, and then certainly CTV and the opportunity there to activate that data. So we've gotten to see what some of those companies are looking for, some of the differences that the CPG advertisers have, and how we can help provide those compelling programs and go out and actually do the buying across the tech stack to deliver there.
So that's fascinating, because that means in 2021, middle of the pandemic, you were actually an agency allowed to use retailer data, go out there and be agnostic to some of the technology that you were using to implement, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, I mean, technology agnostic generally describes my philosophy, but we certainly do have some preferences. And then we work with our clients. We might be we're agnostic. So we'll say, our stack or yours. We've been customers of the Trade Desk since 2012, I think. But if a client says, here's my preferred DSP, or I'd like you to run out of our seat, you certainly can. So we have, for PetSmart, we've worked with a variety of different tools there, but it's really about what's the best way to get their data into all the different endpoints where we can then go and buy that specific customer, right? Hey, somebody shops dog food but doesn't buy your brand. Can we find them across Meta, Google, the open web, and maybe some certain CTV providers? So we've done some work on what's the best route there, but of course there are always going to be commercial arrangements to that as well. How much does it cost is an important factor too.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what's fascinating for me is hearing that as far back as 21, somebody wasn't just leading with a technology. Because I think my experience at Quotient, you have Epsilon, others, it was a marriage. It was a 1-to-1, and there wasn't. And Todd and I have talked about this in other episodes. Offsite is no longer a winner take all world. There are multiple DSPs. We were talking to Costco, and they're working with multiple DSPs. But that wasn't really the case in 2021. So you have more learning than the average bear in terms of how the pathways work, in terms of where to put the budget. But also, you probably have some really interesting insights in sort of what's broken, how measurement works and shouldn't work. And so would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, definitely. And just to stay on the tech side for a moment, I think, Todd probably knows this, but I think there's a huge opportunity for tools to make this easier for brands on the buy side and retailers on the sell side. But I look at this from the media buyer perspective of what is the tool, how much does it cost, how much value is it adding, and does it get me what I need to get? So there are a lot of different ways that you can buy ads on Meta, but they're generally run through the same API. And is it worth it? And if you want to bring in TikTok, is the tool that you have integrated with them, and often the tools that are good for buying social are not necessarily so good for buying display or programmatic CTV. So we navigate that every day as media buyers, but we also, working with PetSmart, we did, just as an example, looking at growing on CTV, trying to get the best match rates. So if you have first party data, connected TV should be very good for that. It's a logged in environment for the most part. So if you've got an email address, you can match that. But at the time, Google's DV360 wasn't leveraging IP address. They didn't necessarily have the same granularity. robustness in targeting. So if we pushed an audience to them, the scale was lower. So we said, hey, we can look at that and test them against the trade desk. And guess what? We can reach, X% more, significantly more households in that first party data set with a different tool. So I'm in favor of anything that helps kind of streamline and organize that. But I do think the messy nature of the ecosystem means that there will be folks that have a strength in one area and maybe not in another. And you got to be comfortable working with them and piecing them together, but making it a seamless solution for the brand who just wants to buy a package and find their audience wherever it makes the most sense.
Well, I think that's interesting because we have definitely talked to a couple other agency people or media buyers about buying retail media, and the challenges you talk about in terms of there is no perfect cross retailer solution. There's no perfect solution in terms of match rates and audience integration. It's kind of like programmatic 2007 all over again, right? Where there was no dominant platform, different SSPs were integrated with different DSPs. It was a wild west, and it's kind of that same thing. You even look at like Horizon trying to build a cross retailer buying platform in Neon. I don't know if you've tried that. And there's some others that are emerging that we're talking about. So I think it's interesting. To me, one of the things that's holding back the rise of retail media truly taking over online media is the tooling. Like, it's not as seamless as it should be. It's not as easy. It really takes, to your credit, Marcus, as a sophisticated buyer, a sophisticated tool user, you're having to really do a lot of that work to make this work. And I think that's an interesting stage of where we're at, which is if we want to see more agencies, media agencies buying retail media, the tooling needs to improve and make your lives easier. Otherwise, it limits, I think, some of the things you might do in other circumstances.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a double-edged sword because agencies love complexity, right? So if we can help
True. It does
solve
make
for
it
some of
easier to
that,
sell in your services. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I believe this is going to get better, and there are some very smart people working on some tools to add things in. The retail media space has also changed and grown very quickly. So can the tools keep up with
Right.
that growth and kind of what's required across the board, I think is the question. And if you look at something that is trying to be, across a lot of retailers, there's a lot of difference in terms of how they operate, what they're doing, what they're willing to provide. I think the complexity there is limited, that there aren't necessarily standards that you can apply, right? If a lot of that is done through API and they're working with their own tech, it's not like building to an IAB spec RTB. So I think there will always be a need to say, here's a tool and here's how we can maybe supplement that. And I think you're seeing that with some of the larger players now, where they're selling a tool, but there's also a managed service component, and they might be putting a little bit more together on the back end. We're transparent with our clients in terms of what we're using, but many advertisers, they just want it to work. I think, Todd, what you're saying, there's clearly a lot there, but an area that really interests me is the measurement and how that can be brought together, or maybe is not being brought together. So you're seeing retail media is growing, that growth might be
Yep.
slowing a little bit. It can't grow faster than digital advertising forever. If it eventually becomes the market, it's going to have to grow at the same rate as the market. So,
Yep.
eMarketer, I think, is predicting that, I think by 2029, they're forecasting still a slightly higher pace of growth for retail media than digital media, but I think it's something like 10% and 7, as opposed to it's been nearly like double the rate for the past few years.
Right.
So as we get there, I think about like, where's that growth coming from? And we really focus on this area in terms of our expertise, but I think the opportunity is largely in offsite, right? If you've got, Amazon or Walmart, I don't have any internal data that anybody else doesn't, but I think they're doing a pretty good job of monetizing visitors to their properties. And I don't think there's that much that's going unmonetized. I'm sure there's room for them to grow that, but at a certain point, they either need to, that's the same thing as any media owner, right? Get more eyeballs or sell more ad slots, right? And I think cramming more ad slots into your sponsored listings is not necessarily going to be helpful in the long run. So I think you see that the growth opportunity is really going to come from offsite. And then for all of the smaller retailers that don't have Amazon or Walmart level
Yep.
web traffic, but still have valuable data. That's the growth. And it's a much different beast in terms of how it gets bought, but also typically how it gets measured compared to things like an Instacart or a DoorDash or Amazon sponsored listings. So that's something that's really interesting to me.
Are you saying that's more of like a still a last click problem versus a multi-touch, or what would tell us what your thinking is there?
Yeah, I think the attribution really gets to be part of it. And I listened to a great session, Eleanor Hayden. You guys had her on recently, and she touched on this from the other perspective, really in the closed loop attribution of like, hey, can we see somebody clicks on our sponsored listing, adds it to the cart, checks out? That is, a lot closer to traditional performance marketing, direct response
Yep.
media. We put that kind of in line with like a paid search or shopping of what are we driving from a click to purchase standpoint. That measurement doesn't work at all for connected TV, where generally speaking, you
Right.
can't click, and it doesn't work nearly as well for something where there's a heavy in-store component as well.
Right.
So
Right.
you might, if you have good loyalty data, a retailer can still do some of that closed loop attribution, but it becomes, Todd, to use a dirty word, I hope you don't have to put explicit on here if I say view through, but it is going to be a
You
post view
have been listening to
exposure.
our episodes.
Yeah.
That's good.
If I see an ad on Hulu for Doritos and then I go to the local grocery store and buy Doritos, and that can be tracked together because I keyed in my phone number, that's attribution. Is it that much different than
Yeah.
if I see an ad on Instacart and add them there? Incrementality is the real question, I think, in both of those cases, but it takes a little bit
Well,
of a different mindset.
I think the problem right now is that the people who are pushing CTV hard are trying to like get people to buy it with their remote or QR codes and things like that. I love all that tech, but we need to get to a place where we're forcing the measurement to deal with the multiple channels that really drive the business. And just pushing shoppable media isn't going to get us there.
Yeah, I agree. And so, Tom, I think I love that stuff. It can be fun to play around with, and we've seen some cool executions and some decent results depending on what you're looking at. I think, what Amazon's doing with Prime makes a lot of sense to have that, add to your cart, one click on the remote, because they've really got the control there. But I've seen results for a lot of QR code type campaigns or engagement rate campaigns. And it's if you like click-through rates on programmatic display, you'll love the response rates for these things. People are sitting there watching content. They're not in a lean forward shoppable mindset, right? So
Yeah.
part of me says television I think for a long time has arguably been the most effective form of advertising. And
Yep.
it's never been clickable. But ask any
Right.
serious CPG marketer, right? Does TV work, right? And do you have the data? Like they pretty much built the advertising measurement industry as we know it today. So saying, hey, what if we could make that as effective as a 300 by 250 with a 0.04% click-through rate? Feels like the wrong answer to me. Can we play with fun areas of engagement? Is inviting the consumer to do something, or giving them an offer that they can respond to smart in some cases? Yes, but is that going to solve the measurement problem? I think absolutely not. And when you talk about maybe less highly considered purchases and things that you buy at grocery, fast moving consumer goods, do I really want to mess around with all that? I mean, yeah, I keep a shopping list sometimes. I know some people are fanatic about that, but I think a lot of people go to the grocery store and they buy the stuff that they always buy at the grocery store,
Oh yeah.
and a couple other things for a recipe. And maybe they're swayed when they're there in the chip aisle to try out a new product, and maybe they were influenced by marketing to do that. But I just think that most people, if they're buying something that's like $5, they're not doing that level of consideration. Let me research it online beforehand and add it to my app and all that. So you're not going to have that full connection of
Right.
engagement. I clicked on the CTV ad, etc. So it brings you back to a little bit of back to basics of how have we measured linear television? How do you measure the success of CTV or offline or upper funnel channels. So I think a lot of that is falling more to the brand budgets. It's also, if you're going to spend a lot of money, then we're seeing, CPG companies are saying, okay, well, this is coming out of our brand budget. We need to evaluate it the same way that our brand media agency might do. And it needs to perform in that fashion, because it's not going to on a last click basis.
Right.
But I think you've got this little bit of a loggerhead situation where some of the same companies are selling, hey, I can give you a 8-to-1 ROAS on sponsored search results, and you can see closed loop attribution in our system the same day. And now they're trying to say, oh, and also come and buy our CTV offering, leveraging the data, when the measurement should really be a lot different, and maybe it should come out of a different budget that probably isn't expecting to see the results as immediately. I think that can be highly effective, but you've got a much longer time horizon to that impact, depending on the variety of factors, the product being one of them, and also the way that you measure it. I'm a believer in above the line brand media, whatever you want to call it. We say, full funnel, but CTV can be highly effective, but how you actually measure that and whether you can track to the incrementality, I would argue in some cases it's just as effective as some other digital touch points where they're getting over attributed today. So it's the same problem as, Google.com branded keyword, yeah.
Yes, the biggest lie in the industry is Google stealing the attribution for that.
Right.
Sure.
Same thing is happening on Amazon, right? If I go and type
Right.
bounty paper towels in and click on the first link, that's contributing to that blended really high ROAS number that the buyer's seeing. Is it helpful? Yes. Is it incremental? I think it is. But is it a 10x ROAS,
It's
or
not
what a lot of those
8 or 8,
people
right.
click?
It's not 8x, 10x exactly. Are you seeing, to your point about measurement and to the CTV as a part of retail media as an example of, are the CPG guys or your clients, are they using, media mix modeling like they would for linear TV? Is it, because that hasn't been used as much with digital, but maybe we need to start bringing that in, to your point of, we got to bring in the media mix modeling guys who live and die, with linear TV. And if we're not doing that, maybe that's the mistake.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're seeing just an increase in that kind of demand coming from the larger CPG players. And I think that there's some nuance there in terms of what data do they need to power their models. I think classic media mix modeling provides a lot of value, but you talk to people about it and they say, oh, is that the thing where I have to wait a year to get my results and all this, right?
I was gonna say, I was like, say it ain't so. That's like the whole thing people are excited about with retail media is you're getting results a lot faster. So
But to the point, I think it's interesting you talk about the time delay within store, right? There's a company that Tom and I work with that in store is a big component of their business. Online, in fact, 99% of orders done online are picked up in store. And so they need a 28-day attribution window from order to completion. And it kind of speaks to that. There's this, maybe it's not a year, but there's a time delay factor, exactly what you're talking about. You see it on Hulu, and then it's your next store visit, which could be 3 days, 7 days, 14 days away. And so we need to start thinking about how do we expand, I think, these attribution windows where it's not impression to click, it's going to be impression to store visit to whatever. And we're going to start dealing in 28-day windows again and not same session. Again, and it's a big change to where digital has been for the last 10 to 15 years, obviously.
Yeah. I think there's also a lag effect sometimes on the media. So we see like the half-life value of, or the ad stock effect of video tends to be a lot longer. So you're actually seeing the impact of, right, if you run a heavy video campaign 1 month later, that's still creating influence. And then when you bring in the in-store element, right, frequency, how often are you visiting, right? If it's grocery, that's maybe a little bit faster. But if you talk about specialty retail, there are some of those stores that people might only visit a few times a year, depending on their need, or when they're running out of staples. But to go back to Tom, you'll have to wait 2 years to get your data. Sorry. I think there are a lot of models that are being run within brands now that are probably not called MMM. There's been a great rebranding, but I think also evolution of modeling results, but not necessarily, and it's built off of that traditional MMM. but not in the same very coarse way of just load in your, impressions for last month. So we're seeing a lot of companies that are doing something that is similar, but taking much more granular inputs on the digital side, taking into account any, experiments that are running, and are able to push out results much faster. You still do have a certain amount of constraints as, did somebody have time to go into the store yet, for example? But we've seen cases where we can get data refreshed on a weekly basis, but it is modeled based on the inputs of media and marketing activity, not based on a click and a pixel fire, which I think has staying power because it can work across different channels and it doesn't require that matching of unique IDs across households, cookies, emails, and things that might not be that durable.
If you're looking for that type of change to happen in the industry, you were suggesting there might be sort of organizational changes that need to happen. I think we're seeing with like Unilever, they're talking about we're 20xing the creators that we work with. We're also putting different teams together to make sure we're sort of aligning better with the retailer's JBP processes. What do you think on the measurement side needs to happen at the CPG side to really drive this change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've not been inside of a CPG organization, but from some of what I've seen, there's a need, I think, to bring together the advertising effectiveness people, as I said, especially the larger companies. They've got people who really understand how this stuff works. They've got a lot of data and they can tell if something's driving incremental value to them in terms of sales or, net new households. Bringing them together with the shopper and increasingly the digital people. So a lot of these brands are still relatively new to digital, right? And I mean, we saw it during the pandemic. We were working with Halo Top Ice Cream, and they had not done a lot of online selling of ice cream. It's something you pretty much go to the freezer aisle and get. We were working like quickly standing up, like they were working with Micmac and like, how can we drive,
Yep.
more delivery and testing that out. And of course they saw a huge surge in their, delivery business and buy online, pick up in store through some of the marketplaces, especially. But that wasn't that long ago. And this is, a major company that knows what they're doing and just starting to get into looking at Google Analytics conversion events and things like that. So I think that's come a long way. And you have folks who are very digitally savvy and understand that like direct response ecosystem, but they don't necessarily have the same experience that the full kind of advertising suite ad effectiveness people do on incrementality. Would this have happened anyways, right? If a product is bought on Amazon, was it because you had a sponsored listing there? So trying to marry those two together and get some more of the old school traditional media and the digitally savvy people talking, what you'll find is they might say, look, we have all this data and all that you're taking into your model is what did we spend on X channel last week and how many impressions did we get? The model could be a lot better that's looking
Right.
at everything, including out of home and linear TV and PR and all that, if you have more granular digital feeding into it. And then on the flip side, the measurement folks might be able to say, well, let's look at, are there some experiments that we could run to help determine a little bit more of the incrementality of some of these things, even if the spend isn't as high as in, our linear TV budget, we can probably work with you to get a finer tune on what's really incremental and at the very least, validate what's coming back out of the platforms. But I think increasingly, I don't want to say discarding that, but the grading your own homework that you get out of a lot of these platforms telling you your ROAS, you can do a little incrementality testing and say, Todd, to your point, great, branded sponsored listings, they do provide value, but it's a 2-to-1 instead of a 10-to-1 ROAS. You can basically get a multiplier to put in there and kind of monitor your campaigns that way, in addition to incorporating that into a broader incrementality model.
But getting back to the organization, you're basically saying you can't get a Gen Xer from Dish Networks to merge with a Gen Z GoPuff person on the measurement side. You can't create this digital czar that's measuring things on both the sort of long-term look back and the short term. That's a unicorn that doesn't exist, right?
I mean, as an aging dog myself, I like to think we can all learn new tricks. So I don't think it's strictly that from a demographic standpoint. I think it's, yes, there are some people who carry all of that knowledge and have done it all, and they've bought television and Instacart, but there's only so many hours in a day. So I think it's more
Yeah,
about connecting people who have those specialties and bring that
right.
experience in different areas,
Well,
which is happening, but oftentimes there's still separate budgets, separate teams, separate agencies managing all that. So there's not much incentive for that brand measurement person to go and see what's going on with the shopper marketing people.
yeah. Well, I mean, I
One
feel
of
like
the
Amazon, yeah, I was going to say, I closed that one out. I feel like Amazon now is in a situation where they have that expertise internally, which is very much about that very short conversion window. But now they're pushing very hard on CTV. And there was a good Eric Seufert post that we'll put in the show notes about how they're going to be the CTV data engine going forward. But they're going to have to deal with this mismatch of measurement. And I don't know where they're at with that. I know that Google and Meta have their own MMM plus models or whatever that are sort of trying to hybrid the longer term and the shorter term. But, do you think it's Amazon that drives this, or is there an agency that you think?
and actually, Tom, let me add to that. My comment was
Yeah.
going to be, is this an industry standards issue, right?
Yeah.
Which does IAB need to get involved, much like some of the other organizations did on linear TV? Are we, like ANA and what have you, are we going to need to see something where there needs to be more standardization of terms and definitions, and what does measurement mean from platform A versus provider B? And maybe that's a part of this too, which is, I don't think it's, I think, Tom, I'd be shocked if Amazon's it, because Amazon's only on Amazon.
Right.
And I think that's there. I don't feel, because the data is so siloed, because it has to be, because it's first party, that you're ever going to have a winner takes all aspect on this. But does standardization make it easier for a multi-tenant buyer like you, Marcus, easier? And is that something that we need to start seeing to make it this combination of data, this combination of different channels, this combination of different retailers, data start to come together? Is that standardization piece? And maybe does that come from IB or some other organization?
Yeah, so I think two interesting questions there. First, Tom, on the Amazon side, I think they're forcing the conversation. So you've got a lot of people who are buying Amazon, they're seeing it effective on that kind of closed loop attribution side. And by just opening the floodgates of Prime Video, they've kind of changed the CTV landscape, and then allowing you to bring that data there. I think you've got a lot of people who are maybe more on the Eleanor Hayden side of things, who have been doing that really good response oriented work. And now, one of the biggest platforms they work with has this whole new channel. So they're going to be, at the very least, playing around with it and finding they need a little bit of a different measurement. And now it depends, right? But like, do sponsored listings on Amazon drive incremental actions off Amazon? Potentially, right? I might go and search for olive oil, see a Graza listing, and say, oh, you know what? I'll buy it from them directly, or I'll get it at Costco, when I'm there next week. That hasn't really been a measurement challenge that people have been thinking about. It's more like, if I serve the ad on Amazon, do I get the conversion on Amazon?
Right.
I think when you take that to Prime Video, that really gets to be a problem that everybody's going to have to solve, and they'll find it as soon as they see their first performance report, is kind of what I'm thinking. So they're not going to necessarily solve it, but I think they're going to force the issue there of, okay, where does this come from? For anybody who hasn't done that already, and I will say a lot of brands have started to establish, okay, here's how we go to market, and here's what we're doing with retailers A, B, and C, and the budgets might be combined. So like, there's a certain amount that's really out of the shopper budget here, and we're measuring it this way, and then there's a certain amount that's out of the brand budget, and it all needs to fit into our model. We need to ensure that we can get data back in the format we need. Todd, as far as whether standards will solve this, I think there's room for improvement there. I think what I'd like to see more of, maybe like on the IAB side of things, is on the buying, the specs, the definitions there, making that easier for companies, like you mentioned earlier, to build tool sets that really work across the spectrum. Some standards would help there, the same way that an RTB spec enabled companies like the Trade Desk. On the measurement side, I think standardization will also help, but what we see is every company is different. Their media mix is different, and how they track success and what they're looking at. So we kind of have to conform things to them. I think an interesting example is just like, how do you define a channel? Like, what partner fits into a channel? That's often a measurement
Right.
question. We can set standards until the cows come home, but if an advertiser says, "Oh, no, well, we call this partner CTV and this partner online video," it's like they don't care, right? You buy Hulu, and
Right.
most of the time you're getting it on whatever screen they're watching. That happens to be majority CTV, but you can't even
Right.
necessarily parse that out unless you want to pay more to say exclude people watching on their tablets. But we see those kind of situations of Google, and as they're moving to Performance Max, how do we put that into a bucket of a channel if they're leveraging YouTube and search and shopping and display? So we have different taxonomies for different clients to conform to what they call a channel, and we're not going to say that's wrong. That's
Right.
not really social. So I think that's just a little bit of the work that every advertiser has to do to make the data work for them. And thankfully that's getting easier to pull things from different platforms and kind of standardize them, but that's probably going to be more on a per advertiser basis than something that I'm counting on a white horse standards body to come in and solve for us.
I think one of the things that comes across in this conversation is the realities of how technical media buying is online in all its fashions and forms. And as retailers, as second and third tier retailers start to get into this business, and right, they're now adopting retail media or trying to build this out, join the party, so to speak. And I think your business of being like an in-house team to help to offer to their advertisers as they do this is an interesting one, because I think they're not necessarily without the experience. Like you and I have been in the media buying space for digital for a long time and understand its technical complexities. And so I think it speaks to there is an expertise required. Like if you're just a retailer getting into this, you have no idea what you're getting into and what you're going to need to really deliver results and service to your brands. And so I think that's interesting. One of my takeaways from this conversation is that technical expertise is required. And I can see why you got into that business, right? Working with PetSmart. And are you looking to grow that business? Are you looking to bring on other retailers? Do you think this is something that would be appropriate for, the type of agency you are and kind of a future? Or do you think you'll be more on the client direct side who's buying retail media and helping execute it? Or maybe a mixture of both?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we're very much on the buy side. So I think in some of those cases we can be like you guys, a little bit of middlemen there. But if there's media buying to be done, we're happy to help, and I think we can add a lot of value to an organization, whether they're a brand or a retailer. And there's some kind of advisory stuff that can come into that in terms of how does this buying happen. So there's maybe a little bit of a nuance there in terms of like who's actually buying the media, right? If
Right.
you go and purchase something from a retail media network, but it's offsite, it's CTV, right? Like what's happening is that retailer is buying that media and they're reselling it to the
Yep.
CPG. So I think we can certainly provide a lot of help in doing that activation, that media buying, and at a certain amount of scale and efficiency that is probably not worth doing in house, but also providing some customization that you might not get by going with a kind of pure plug and play provider. So we're happy to help there. I think on the technical side, Todd, there certainly is some technical nuance, and we can advise on that, but I think a lot of it is more just bringing the experience and understanding what media buyers are going to be looking for and
Right.
how to set up an offering and a product suite that allows for that customization without going crazy and having bespoke plans for every single one of your CPG companies. If you're building a product and if there's a managed service element to that product, it makes it easier to handle some of this. But brand X is going to say, I don't want to advertise on Fox News. Brand Y is going to say, I don't want to advertise on MSNBC. How do you handle that, right? Or somebody else might say, here's my brand safety playbook, and I need you to be able to
Right.
adhere to that. And maybe it involves this other third party. So that's where we can, I think, navigate that pretty easily and say, here's what probably a lot of folks are going to want, and maybe ask them these 5 questions in their onboarding so that they don't just see their ad on whatever website they didn't want to be on? How are you handling MFA and filtering? How are you looking at where your ads are serving programmatically and ensuring that your advertisers are aware of what they're kind of signing up for, or what tools they have to say block these domains or channels? So we can help with managing all that, but also asking the questions before they start to become problems, with the ultimate goal of what's going to provide incremental value, because these brands are buying other retailers, they're buying their own media, and just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a net benefit to them. So it's really finding that intersection of, when you're talking about offsite, proprietary first party data, we've got information on shoppers that you can't get anywhere else, and marrying that with the most effective, best quality inventory. So we have a lot of experience doing that for advertisers of all stripes, and then saying, and how can we scale that, and try and spend each dollar almost as effectively as the last, as we go up, and continue to drive incremental value as budgets increase.
Having looked over your shoulder and seeing the work you've done and your team has done, I can certainly say, and I've always felt this, you and your team really know what you're doing, and you all are true experts at digital media buying. And so for anyone, I can easily endorse you for having seen your work and using some of the tools that I've built and sold to you in the past, and can speak to that. So for anyone looking for someone who knows what he's talking about, if it wasn't apparent already through this conversation, Marcus and team really know what they're doing and talking about. And Eleanor before also is a good example, but I think you as well, and this expertise sort of shows up because I think as retailers now are stepping into the media business, they quickly realize there's a lot they don't know, and there's a lot of expertise in the online media world that they can leverage. And I think your involvement and your team's involvement is a good example of that. The discussion around measurement, I think, is true. The different channels and what these people are going to be looking for is important. And retail media has the potential to really solve a couple of important pain points for digital media. Like, again, not having to rely on crappy third-party data, real attribution, and new offerings that are coming, like in CTV, and sort of this multi-channel or multi-format opportunity. And I'm pretty excited and bullish on where retail media is going to be. I think there's some changes that occur, like how do we make it easier for agencies to buy, especially non-endemic buys. I think that every retailer we talk to is like, oh, I desperately want to get non-endemic dollars. And we're like, oh, whoa, hold on. You get your endemic stuff to work first, and then we can start talking non-endemic. And, the things you're talking about, I think, speak to that, of the challenges around, if you're a non-endemic buyer buying into this, as cool as it might be. I think that's where the future goes. So maybe a good way to as we're coming up on time here is, where do you see the future of retail media in comparison to traditional digital media? Obviously, Tom and I are very bullish on it. And are you as bullish? What do you think? Where is this business in 3 to 5 years? Do you see tighter relationships between retailers and publishers? The rise of, some people have said, you know what, we're going to go back to 2006, where we're going to basically recreate the old ad networks as these partners. Said Offsite won't be programmatic; it'll be true networks that emerge, or other examples as CTV become the true pinnacle of retail media. I'd love to get your perspective on where do you think this business goes in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, well, thank you, Todd. And it's an interesting question to ponder, because for me, at a certain point, anything that has been growing like so quickly, I feel like is due for a little bit of a stumble. So I feel like there are going to be some ups and downs. I expect we'll see that continued growth, but it's not a catch-all solution to solve every problem. And I think you're going to start to see where a lot of retailers have kind of saturated or gotten close to a saturation point of their on-site media, and then they're doing good work off-site, but looking to how can we grow that. So I think you're going to start to see some cases where it doesn't make sense for the brands to keep growing at the rate that they have been when they look at the true incremental, they're measuring it, their return. So you'll start to see a little bit of stumbling there. And, I think this is obviously tied into JVP and shelf space. And you look at what Walmart was doing, just asking for a big increase, and they can do that. Most retailers probably can't, right? The Wawa retail media network probably can't say increase, double your budgets or else. But to me,
Oh,
it's a
don't sell the goose short. I don't know.
okay. So to me, that's a
No,
little
I'm
bit of a
kidding.
sign.
I actually think you might have already said that the stumbling is already happening with, because Walmart was definitely called out for having those large increases. I think
If
that's a form of stumble, I would think.
if they're mandating it, that feels like it's a problem, right? And so, we haven't been in those conversations, but as a buyer, I want to be increasing my budgets 25% because performance is great. And I'm saying, can you
Right.
take 40? What kind of inventory do you have?
Right.
But when they say you've got to do this to play ball, that's a sign that we're maybe starting to hit that point. And I think there's a lot more work to be done to say, what is the audience that we have, the value that we can bring for whatever unique data we have, and how can we make that reach as far and wide into effective channels as possible. So Todd, I think that's where you might start to see some of
Right.
that network side of things. Of if we do a tighter partnership with Disney, can we, if you can increase your
Right.
match rates by 5% on tens of
That's
millions
a
of
5% increase of
households,
avails. Right. Yep.
right, then your budget can increase 5%, right? Whereas
Right.
otherwise, you're talking about, are you increasing frequency against the same households, or are you
Right.
expanding out? Or are you doing lookalikes? So I think we're starting to get to that point where you might start to see, wow, this performance has been so great, it's been so great, it's been so great. And then if you keep increasing your budgets, you're getting to like that diminishing returns curve for some advertisers. So you'll start to see, it's forecasted some of that slowdown, but I think that's going to force some more of that hard work to be done, right? It doesn't make for as good of a case study to say we did all this work and tested different ways, and now we have six different ways that we can onboard our data to Disney, and we got an 8% match rate increase.
Right.
Sounds like a snooze fest, but like that's actually the hard work that maybe
Right.
needs to be done to fulfill that growth, right? And times everybody else, find those good inventory providers, make sure that you're as tight as you can get with them, and that they're working across each other as well, because that's obviously another issue with some of the ad network models is,
Yep.
are you providing incremental value with Disney? Great, but not if somebody just was binging on Peacock and saw you there. So managing that holistically, I think, is where technology can really help at that household level of who do we really want to reach, who's eligible to be an incremental customer for us, and let's make sure, again, going a little back to basics, that we're reaching as many of those people as we can at an optimal frequency that's neither too high or too low to drive impact.
Great. Thank you, Marcus, for joining us on the Middlemen. Really enjoyed the discussion. Would love to hear how things go over time, as you being one of the only agency people out there who are able and have the experience to tell brands, I've done this on the retailer side, I know this world. It would be great to hear more from you about your experience and your thoughts. So keep in touch.
Absolutely, we'll do. Appreciate it, guys. This has been fun.